I want to begin by saying a few words about Alan and his writing and his grant from JTF. He's been described by the Washington Post as the poet laureate of science writers. Without question, he ranks among the finest science communicators in the English-speaking world. Alan has held appointments on the physics faculties of Cornell, Harvard, and MIT, and he was the first person in the history of MIT to hold dual appointments on both the humanities and the science faculty. In addition to his scientific research, he is the author of 7 novels, 10 nonfiction books, and hundreds of essays, poems, and short stories. His first novel, Einstein's Dreams, was an international bestseller and has been translated into 30 languages and inspired more than 50 independent theatrical adaptations, including in 2019 as an off-Broadway musical. His most recent book, which was published 2 weeks ago, is Probable Impossibilities, Musings on Beginnings and Endings. Last June, the board of JTF approved a $1.8 million proposal to support the production and distribution of a documentary based on Alan's critically acclaimed book, Searching for Stars on an Island in Maine. Both the book and the documentary take their inspiration from Lightman's experience of a moment of pure transcendence. If you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read that passage very briefly. My story concerns a particular summer night in the wee hours when I had just rounded the south end of the island and was carefully motoring toward my dock. No one was out on the water but me. It was a moonless night and quiet. The only sound I could hear was the soft churning of the engine of my boat. Far from the distracting lights of the mainland, the sky vibrated with stars. Taking a chance, I turned off my running lights and it got even darker. Then I turned off my engine. I lay down in the boat and looked up. A very dark night sky seen from the ocean is a mystical experience. After a few minutes, my world had dissolved into that star-littered sky. The boat disappeared. My body disappeared. And I found myself falling into infinity. A feeling came over me I'd not experienced before. Perhaps a sensation experienced by the ancients at Font de Gomme. I felt an overwhelming connection to the stars, as if I were a part of them. And the vast expanse of time, extending from the far distant past long before I was born, and then into the far distant future long after I will die, seemed compressed to a dot. I felt connected not only to the stars, but to all of nature and to the entire cosmos. I felt a merging with something far larger than myself, a grand and eternal unity, a hint of something absolute. After a time, I sat up and started the engine again. I had no idea how long I'd been lying there looking up. That experience inspired him to examine the differences and similarities between the physical world and what one might call the spiritual world. Now, a few words about the grant. In cooperation with the Chicago Media Project, Alan has partnered with Jeffrey Haynes Stiles to create a film that would, as they put it, not only relate scientific discoveries to the big questions we ask about ourselves and our relationship to the universe, but also acknowledge that there are human experiences, such as consciousness and love, that are not easily reducible to zeros and ones. Haynes Stiles, I should note, is an accomplished filmmaker who was a senior producer on Carl Sagan's original Cosmos series. In addition to producing the documentary, the grant will support the creation of a suite of online resources, the presentation of the film at colleges and universities across the country, and the development of hands-on, inquiry-based informal education programs intended for underrepresented communities at science museums across the nation, including at the Franklin Institute here in Philadelphia. Go Eagles. Today, he will talk about what he calls spiritual materialism, or how a person can be a materialist and also be spiritual. And with that, let me hand it over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Chris. I want to say, first of all, that I'm honored to have been invited to talk to you this morning. And I especially want to thank Chris Levenick and Miss Dill and everyone at Templeton for encouraging me and my work and supporting me. So thank you. I've worked as a physicist for many years, and I've always held a purely scientific view of the world. And by that, I mean that the universe is made of material and nothing more, that the universe is governed by a small number of fundamental forces and laws, and that all composite things in the world eventually disintegrate. And even at the age of 12 or 13, I was impressed by the logic and the materiality of the world. When I was a teenager, I built my own laboratory. And among other projects, I began making pendulums by tying a fishing weight to the end of a string. And I'd read in Popular Science or some other magazine that the time for a pendulum to make a complete swing is proportional to the square root of the length of the string. And with the help of a stopwatch and a ruler, I verified this wonderful law. Logic and pattern, cause and effect. As far as I could tell, everything was subject to analysis and quantitative tests. And I didn't see any reason to believe in anything non-material. I didn't see a reason to believe in anything that could not be proved. And yet, after that experience I had in the boat many years later that Chris narrated, which was one night, very late after midnight, when I was alone in the boat, lying on my back looking up at the stars. After that experience, I understood the allure of the ethereal, feelings that are not necessarily provable, experiences that are not reducible to some kind of logical analysis. And at the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, I remained a scientist. I remained committed to the material world. For thousands of years, we human beings have been torn between the material and the immaterial. Modern science has shown us that all things in the material world are permanent and ultimately pass away, including human beings, of course. Atoms, once thought to be indivisible and indestructible, can be split. Stars, once thought to be eternal and even divine, eventually use up their nuclear fuel and burn out. And even our entire universe, once thought to be the ultimate and largest unity, is considered by some physicists today to be only one of a vast number of universes, many of which do not have the right conditions for life. And yet, we long for something that is eternal. Part of us wants to reduce everything to atoms and molecules, which of course are governed by logic and laws and are impermanent. And part of us wants to resist that temptation, wants to believe that some things defy that kind of reduction. This tension between the material and the ethereal has been the source of our science on one hand and our religion and spirituality on the other. This tension comes into the discussion of all kinds of things like free will versus determinism, the understanding of consciousness, questions of ethical and moral behavior, and discussions of art and aesthetics. It's certainly related to the definition and boundaries of science and what constitutes faith. For me, the human body is the most amazing and baffling phenomena in the material world. Some years ago, I had a colonoscopy. I don't know whether any of you have had colonoscopies yet, but I had a colonoscopy some years ago without being fully anesthetized and was able to watch on a computer screen the shifting views of the inside of my colon. I was dismayed. There, in digital detail, was the deep interior of my body, a realm I'd always considered as mysterious, a forbidden temple, fragile and secretive as it went about its profound business of keeping me alive. And surely that mystical place had to be separate from the world of tables and chairs. And gratefully hidden from the gaze of my eyes. But there it was on the screen with no illusions. I was shocked to see ordinary flesh. I was shocked to see gelatinous membranes like quivering jelly, whitish in color, with bumps and ridges and turns. I felt like a trespasser in my own body. My colon was just material stuff, and I am just material stuff, or so I believe. I know this intellectually, but I recoil from the idea. In recent years, I've gotten to know a prominent Buddhist monk in Cambodia by the name of Yosthut Kemakero. His friends just call him Kema. And after the destruction of the Khmer Rouge genocide in the 1970s, I don't know whether you remember that, Kema played a major role in rebuilding the Buddhist monkhood in Cambodia. And I visited him one warm day in January in Cambodia at Wat Lanka, his monastery on a busy avenue in Phnom Penh. I was hoping that he might help me understand that communion that I had with the stars that summer night in Maine. Wat Lanka is a large temple complex. It contains several pagodas, patios, and walkways, and living quarters for some 200 monks. It has a magnificent front gate that rises 40 feet high and is guarded by stone lions on both sides. But as soon as you step through that edifice, you leave behind the city. You leave behind the steady drone of motos and the shouting of street sellers, and you enter a realm of serenity. Slowly, I walk past the gold leaf pagodas. I pass the stone stupas and the scattered stone pots filled with pink and red bougainvillea. I pass through courtyards with young men in orange robes, quietly strolling in pairs. And eventually I came to Kema's living quarters, which was a tiny house at the back end of the complex. We sat under some trees. There was a faint scent of jasmine in the air. Under the trees, Kema and I began discussing modern physics and cosmology. Buddhism is in complete agreement with science, Kema said and smiled. And then he added, science just puts in more details. Kema explained to me the Buddhist belief that the universe has gone through an infinite number of cycles in the past and will go through an infinite number of cycles in the future. And when I mentioned to him that modern cosmologists have evidence that the universe will continue expanding forever without further cycles, he laughed. Perhaps he thought it was preposterous that science could know such a thing. Or perhaps he thought it was delightful that science could know such a thing. I asked him how Buddhists know that the universe has already gone through an infinite number of cycles. And he said that knowledge comes from the Buddha, one of whose names is the Pali name Lakavidu, which means the knower of worlds. The Buddha knew everything, said Kema. And he took out a pen and scribbled down some books that I should read. And I began thinking to myself, how do we know that the Buddha is the knower of worlds? Were Einstein and Darwin also knowers of worlds? That the truths and laws that we believe about the physical and the spiritual worlds, why do we believe them? And who's the authority? I think science and religion differ profoundly in the way that truths are discovered. In religion and theology, these truths and beliefs seem to have two origins. First, there are the sacred books, such as the Bible and the Quran, the Vedas, the Pali Canon. Believers have faith that these books contain the true word of God or other special enlightened beings. And if so, the authority of the teachings derives from the infinite wisdom associated with those beings. I certainly respect the notions of God and other divine beings, but I do insist on one thing. I insist that any statements made about the material world, including statements in the sacred books, have to be subject to the experimental testing of science. In my view, the truth of those statements cannot be assumed. They must be tested and revised or rejected if needed. The spiritual world has its own domain. The physical world should be the domain of science. And in the physical world, the laws of science cannot apply to some phenomena, but not to others, or apply at some times, but not at others. It's not okay with me if the principles of aerodynamics work on some of my airplane flights, but not on others. The second origin of religious truth and knowledge, and more personal with me and more close to me, in fact, more personal in general, is what one might call the transcendent experience. And I think Chris used that phrase when he was introducing me. Experience is like the one I had looking up at the stars in Maine. The transcendent experience may or may not involve a supreme being who created the universe. And unlike the received wisdom from the sacred books or the pronouncements of religious institutions, the transcendent experience is intensely personal, and the authority of that experience and the understandings gained from it rest in the experience itself. No other person can deny the validity of what you have felt in a transcendent experience. The feelings cannot be disproved. Each transcendent experience, and I'm sure all of you have had them, is a unique event. It cannot necessarily be repeated as in a laboratory experiment. If we turn now to scientific knowledge, I think I can say that it's of two different types. One is knowledge of the properties of physical objects, like the size and mass of a raindrop, and the knowledge of what we call laws of nature. Those are the two types. One of the first human beings to formulate a law of nature, a law of the physical world, was Archimedes more than 2,000 years ago. And it's called his law of floating bodies. And I'll state it. Any solid lighter than a fluid will, if placed in the fluid, be so far immersed or sink down such that the weight of the solid will equal the weight of the fluid displaced. And we can speculate on how Archimedes had arrived at this law. At the time, in the Greek agora, there were plenty of balance scales available for weighing goods in the market. And Archimedes could have first weighed an object, any object, then placed it in a rectangular container of water or mercury or some other liquid and measured the rise and height of the liquid. The area of the container multiplied by the height of the rise would then give the volume of liquid displaced. And finally, that volume of water or mercury could be placed in another container and weighed. So this is how he did it, most likely, and undoubtedly he would have performed this exercise many times with many different objects before devising the law. All the laws of the physical world are like Archimedes' law. They are precise, they are quantitative, and they are general, applying to a large range of phenomena. And more importantly, all the laws of nature discovered by scientists are considered provisional. They're considered to be approximations to deeper laws. And they're constantly being revised as new experimental evidence is found or new ideas are tested. Newton's law of gravity worked beautifully for 2 centuries. until it was discovered that the orbit of the planet Mercury differed very, very slightly in its orbit from what was predicted by Newton's theory, a difference of only about 1/100th of a degree every century. Einstein's theory of gravity replaced Newton's theory 200 years later. Actually, it was more than 200 years. Einstein's theory was in 1915, so it took 300 years. And in fact, here's the point. We know that Einstein's theory is itself slightly wrong because it doesn't include the effects of quantum physics. And so it too will eventually be revised. Of course, the approximate knowledge of science has been good enough to give us antibiotics and smartphones, but every scientific theory we have is considered provisional and an approximation. And it's this process of revision, that we see the strongest differences between the methods and beliefs of science and religion. As I've said, everything that we know about the physical world, the domain of science, has to be tested and revised if necessary. The knowledge of religion, coming from either the divine authority of the sacred books or from the personal transcendent experience, is not subject to revision. It's not an approximation. It's considered to be certain. So, Chris, in his introduction, didn't mention that I go to this island in Maine every summer. And my wife and I have been doing it for the last 30 years. We spend the whole summer on this 30-acre island. And a few years ago, a psychiatrist friend of mine, thinking that I had nothing to do during my long summers in Maine, he gave me a thick book titled Existential Psychotherapy by Irvin Yalom, who is an emeritus professor of psychiatry at Stanford. Now he's about 89 years old. Professor Yalom is an acolyte of the Gestalt psychologists. And those thinkers believe that we naturally and unavoidably tend to organize all of our experience into meaningful patterns. For example, when we see a picture of random dots, we parse it into figures and background. And when we see a broken circle, we mentally complete the circle. A major obstacle for me in the search for meaning is that I've always thought that for something to have meaning, it has to be permanent, or at least last a very long time. And what's the point, I ask myself, of anything that's here today and gone tomorrow, like a meal or a letter or a pair of shoes? By contrast, people still discuss and perform King Lear hundreds of years after it was written. People still gaze in awe at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. But I'm a materialist. And as a materialist, I know that nothing lasts. Even King Lear might be forgotten in 1,000 years. Or if 1,000 isn't long enough for your personal idea of a long time, what about 10,000 years? 10,000 years is the blink of an eye to the cosmos. Everything that I see around me at this moment, I can look outside at the trees, I can look at the books behind me, my entire house, my children, their children, and their children will all be gone without a trace in 1,000 years. In fact, does anything that we do on our modest planet, only one among billions of planets in our galaxy, which is only one among billions of galaxies in the observable universe, does anything have meaning on a grand scale? On the other hand, perhaps my starting assumption that meaning requires permanence is wrong, or maybe meaning itself is an illusion. After all, why should we insist on meanings, on meaning? Fish and squirrels and dogs and cats get by quite well without it. And these are the kinds of unsettling thoughts that run through my mind in the summer when I'm walking around on the island. Actually, they run through my mind all the time. And sometimes I pose to myself this situation, which I'll call the smart ant conundrum, the smart ant conundrum. Imagine a colony of highly intelligent ants. And suppose that this colony has lasted for 100 years. This is an old colony. So over the century, these brainy ants, they've built advanced structures. They've composed music. They create paintings and theater. They write books. They've recorded histories of their civilization. They develop theories about the cosmos inside the anthill and beyond. And they have emotions and intimate relationships, all of that. And then one day, a flood comes and totally destroys the ant colony. Totally. There's nothing left. No ants, no books, no symphonies, no paintings, nothing. Nothing is left. Everything is completely destroyed. There's no trace left in the universe of this magnificent ant colony. So the question I ask myself, did the ant colony have any meaning? And now, after the colony is gone with no record of its existence, does it have any meaning now? So these are the kinds of things that I bother myself with. And I sometimes squint my eyes to try to see Professor Yalom's patterns. I think I see them in the small when I look at reflected sunlight flickering on my bedroom ceiling. That's bouncing off the ocean and then up into my bedroom. Or when I look at hummingbirds hovering near my front porch, I think I see patterns and meaning in the moment, but not beyond. And maybe the moment is all there is. But for some reason, I and many of my fellow travelers are not satisfied with the moment. The now isn't enough. We want to go beyond the moment. We want to build systems and patterns and memories that connect moment to eternity. We want to be part of the infinite. Well, I'll take my last few minutes to discuss some of these issues in a more personal and specific way. And I want to talk about my personal attitude toward death. One could argue that many of our religious and spiritual beliefs are motivated partly by a knowledge of our own physical mortality. All material things are made out of atoms and molecules. And according to the view of science, all material is governed by laws. Immortality is not allowed by the laws. Disembodied existence is not allowed by the laws. Insubstantiality is not allowed by the laws. So I'm a materialist, but I also consider myself a spiritual person. So I am what you might call a spiritual materialist, which is probably going to be the title of my next book. And so how does such a person, a spiritual materialist, confront his own impending death? That night I was lying in the boat in Maine looking up at the stars. I felt a powerful connection to the cosmos, and I'd like to explore that connection a bit more as a spiritual materialist. In fact, all of us are literally connected to stars. All the atoms in our body, except for hydrogen and helium, were manufactured in the centers of stars. If you could tag each of your atoms and follow it backwards in time, one by one, into the air that you breathed during your life, to the food that you ate, back through the geological history of Earth, through the ancient seas and soil and atmosphere, back to the formation of the Earth into interstellar space. You could trace each of your atoms to a particular star. We have very good scientific evidence that all the atoms in our bodies, except the two smallest, hydrogen and helium, were made in the nuclear reactions of stars and then spewed out into space when those stars exploded in supernova. We've seen those stellar explosions with our telescopes and know that they occur. So all the atoms in your body, those exact atoms, came from stars. If instead of going backwards in time, let's go forward in time to my death and beyond. The atoms in my body will remain, only they'll be scattered about. Those atoms won't know where they came from, but they will have been mine. They will have been mine. Some of them will once have been part of the memory of my mother dancing the bossa nova. Some will once have been part of the memory of the vinegary smell of my first apartment. Some will have been once have been part of this hand right here. And if I could label each of my atoms at this moment and imprint each with my social security number, someone could follow them for the next 1,000 years as they floated in air, mixed with the soil, became parts of particular plants and trees, dissolved in the ocean, and then floated again into the air. And some of my atoms will undoubtedly become parts of other people, particular people. Some will become parts of other lives and other memories. So we are literally connected to the stars, and we are literally connected to future generations of people. And in this way, even in a material universe, we are connected to everything. And in this way, we achieve a kind of immortality. Well, thank you for listening.